Welcome to the new episode of our podcast series, where we dive deep into the most pressing topics shaping the future of energy. I'm Ken Lefkovitz, and today we're turning our focus to one of the standout success stories in renewable energy, Ireland's wind energy sector. Ireland is a European leader, with wind energy now accounting for a substantial share of the country's electricity mix, nearly 35% in 2023. That's one of the highest in Europe, and with ambitious targets for 2030, including achieving up to 80% renewable electricity, Ireland is not just aiming high, it is already achieving some of the targets. But as with all transitions, challenges exist, from balancing the electricity grid to managing community impacts and keeping energy affordable while investing in infrastructure. To unpack these topics, we're joined by Noel Къниф, the CEO of Wind Energy Ireland, the country's leading renewable energy association. Noel and his team work at the forefront of policy, advocacy, and innovation to shape Ireland's clean energy future. Let's set the stage for today's conversation. Ireland's wind energy growth is remarkable not only in scale, but also in how it's reshaping national energy policy and public expectations. Here are a few quick facts. Ireland had over 5 gigawatts of wind energy capacity at the end of 2024. Wind outperformed gas for several months last year, but over the full year, gas remained Ireland's top power source, with wind ranking second and providing about one-third of the country's electricity. The Irish government has targeted 5 gigawatts of offshore wind in the first half of the 2030s, a game-changing shift for the island's energy independence and emissions targets. But integrating such a high percentage of wind into the electricity system isn't without complexity. Grid balancing, long permitting timelines, and the need to build public trust are just some of the hurdles Ireland must navigate as it scales up. To help us explore these dynamics, I'm excited to welcome Noel Къниф to the show. Noel, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Ken, and thank you very much to the Bulgarian Wind Association for the invite.
It's a real pleasure. Let's get started with the big picture. What's driving Ireland's rapid adoption of wind energy? What role does Wind Energy Ireland play in maintaining that momentum? What policies are Irish authorities implementing in order to support the development of the sector?
Yeah, it's a good question. So for anyone that's unaware of the geography of Ireland, we are a relatively small island nation on the western edge of Europe. And because of that, we have a really, really strong wind resource coming in from our Atlantic. So we're one of the windiest countries on the entire planet. And we also have to our advantage a number of things. So our onshore sector, our onshore wind sector now, as you mentioned, has crossed 5 gigawatts. That's been up and running for over 30 years now. Our first wind farm was built in 1992. So we have a long history of understanding wind energy. The second real advantage that we have is that our sea area that Ireland controls is 7 times our land area. So we're one of the largest countries in Europe, but 7/8 of us are underwater. And then that creates a huge opportunity for offshore wind energy. So when you can combine those things, that we have a large resource and a large capability, it just makes a lot of sense for us to really focus on wind, because we do not have any other natural resources like oil, gas, coal. It just didn't exist in Ireland. So we are very reliant on imported fuel for our energy system in general. Electricity, we're doing really well, as you mentioned. We've got about 40% renewable electricity now, the vast majority of that coming from wind and a small amount from solar. And we're working towards getting to 80% renewable electricity over the next kind of 6, 7, 8 years or so. So in Wind Energy Ireland, which is the association that I'm responsible for in Ireland, we've brought together companies from all over the sector, from all aspects of the entire supply chain, the developers, the turbine suppliers, but also the banks, the haulage companies, the planning consultancies, grid consultancies involved. So we've over 200 companies as part of our membership, and our role is to work with government to try to enable as much wind energy to be built as possible for the best possible value for the customer. So our role is not just to build out as much wind energy at any price, it's to try to make sure that we can deliver good value for Ireland and reduce prices for consumers, increase the competitiveness of our economy, and try to grow our economy as a result of that as well. So we work a lot with government, work a lot with our members, and work a lot with media and communications, and just getting the positivity out there for what the wind sector can offer. And you mentioned what policies are in place, or you asked me a question around what policies in place. So I would say there's kind of maybe 2 or 3 things to really point towards. Our government has been very focused on specific targets for initially 2020 and then 2030. So we had a target for 2020 of hitting 40% renewable electricity. We've done that. We have a target for 2030 to try to get to 80%. We're probably going to be a little bit late on that, but we're working towards it. And then we have targets, specific capacity targets for onshore wind and for offshore wind. So for onshore wind, we have 5 gigawatts installed today. We're trying to get to 9 gigawatts by 2030. And for offshore wind energy, we're trying to go from a very small 25 megawatt wind farm, which is the only offshore wind farm that we have, to get then up to 5 gigawatts. Again, the target was by 2030, but more likely that's going to happen in the early 2030s. And then this really helps with reducing electricity prices. It's a continual area for jobs growth. We have thousands of people employed in the wind sector now in Ireland. So the good news stories are building up for our sector for certain.
Thank you. I'm hearing some interesting points that we can apply and aspire to here in Bulgaria.
Absolutely.
Ireland already has one of the highest shares of wind energy in its electricity mix in Europe. How is the national grid managing this variability? What technologies or strategies are being used to keep the system balanced and reliable?
That's a really good question, because it's a challenge that Ireland has had to grapple with for 10 years now. Before I joined Wind Energy Ireland, I worked for EirGrid, the transmission system operator here in Ireland. And one of my roles was, how do we integrate more renewable energy into an island grid? We only have 3 HVDC connections to Britain. So we are a synchronous area by ourselves, whereas I guess in continental Europe, there's lots of interconnection. It's all AC interconnection. So if an issue happens in one part, then other parts of the system can help balance it or support it. In Ireland, we're kind of isolated by ourselves, and we need to figure out our own issues and solve them. So EirGrid are excellent when it comes to managing the amount of renewable energy from wind or solar or HVDC imports that they can manage at any point in time. It's one of the highest in the world. We can get up to about 75% of our electricity coming from non-synchronous sources right now. And that's happening on a very regular basis. And the goal is to try to get up to 95% of our electricity from non-synchronous sources by 2030. And I appreciate a lot of your listeners might not, let's say, understand synchronous or non-synchronous, but when you're in an island system operating at a very high volume of wind energy and now solar energy too, these types of things become real issues. And that's one of the challenges. It's learning to try to communicate very new and technical language that are not necessarily megawatts. People understand 1 megawatt of demand, 1 megawatt of power. People don't really understand generally things like inertia or voltage control or reactive power response. And we've seen just recently the report come out on the Iberian blackout, where it seems like reactive power control was the source of that blackout occurring. We're still waiting for the final report, but it's certainly looking that way. So trying to tackle this and find solutions to these issues when you're operating a system with mostly renewable energy has been a challenge. I would say what the government and what EirGrid have really focused on and done very well is they've looked at, how do we get these types of services from non-fossil fuel technology? Because traditionally those types of services were provided by gas plant, by coal plant, by oil plant, synchronous spinning machines. What we've looked at now is how much of that type of service can be provided from wind farms through inverters, or from solar farms, or battery energy storage. We've rolled out over 1 gigawatt of battery energy storage in the last 4 or 5 years. We identified a need for reserves, very fast acting reserves, because we didn't have gas and coal plant online as much. And so we put in place market mechanisms and systems to be able to roll out short duration battery storage, so up to 2 hour storage. The next challenge that we're working on now is longer duration storage. So there's already competitions that are being designed for 8 to 100 hour storage. And that's our goal, to try to roll that out over the next 5 years. One other thing that we've done really well is we've developed competitions for synchronous condensers. So these are just spinning masses of metal that can provide inertia and reactive power. And we've seen them being deployed in places places like Australia, where they have very large amounts of renewable energy installed as well. And when you deploy things like fast-acting batteries, demand response, and synchronous condensers, you can start to take off the oil and coal and gas off your system and get more and more renewable energy on. So it is technically possible to do this.
Fascinating. Thank you. Let's turn to a different topic. As new wind farms are developed, both onshore and offshore, how do we balance the growth of the sector with concerns and interests of local communities? How important is public engagement in ensuring the long-term success of wind energy in Ireland? And how do you address the worries of people, if there are such, and especially at the beginning of the process? And I must say, this is very much a topical issue for us here in Bulgaria.
Yeah, it's so important. It's so important to do this right. It would be very, very rare now in Ireland for a project to start life and end life looking the exact same, because there's a lot of community engagement steps that we've rolled out through best practice guidelines, and our government has mandated through our auction system as well, to try to make sure that people that live in areas, they know their areas better than anybody else. They can give feedback to projects. And it's very often now that turbines might be, let's say, dropped from an offshore or onshore wind farm. Turbines might be moved, or turbine heights might be reduced depending on certain factors that are learned through the community engagement process. I think we learned a lot of lessons. There was a quite a large anti-grid and anti-renewable campaign in Ireland about 10 years ago, when we were trying to roll out very large amounts of grid infrastructure and at the exact same time roll out a lot of wind energy. There was things that could have gone better for certain in terms of how communities were brought on that journey. As a result of that, we put in place, good practice guidelines about when to engage with communities very early in the process, do lots and lots of public and community engagement in advance of a project submitting its permitting application. And now local authorities and the National Planning Authority, they will look for evidence that that type of engagement has happened and been taken into account when they're making their decisions on projects. Other things that we've put in, and this has been a collaboration between the industry and our government, has been a community benefit fund that is mandatory as part of our auction system. So for every winner in an auction, €2 per megawatt hour of energy produced goes into a local community benefit fund, and then the local community decides what to do with that fund. So it's not the developer that decides where to spend the money. It's all about how the community would like to invest it themselves. And we've seen great examples of where sports facilities have been developed, parks have been expanded, or community walks have been put in place, or even where things like paying for home energy retrofits to make them more energy efficient have been rolled out as part of that program. One thing that we try to do as the National Wind Association is to try to take out the positive messaging and build public support for wind energy. That can focus on three things generally: the decarbonisation of our society. So in the power sector, we have very, very strong legislation to try to reduce our carbon emissions in our power sector. And if we don't do that, there are going to be fines placed on us by Europe, but also by the government. And wind energy is a fantastic tool to try to remove that carbon emissions. And I think the public really gets that. The big thing, though, is around affordability. So because we're on the edge of Europe, we are at the end of the gas pipeline in Europe, and we're very isolated when it comes to the price that we pay for our gas. We have the most expensive gas prices in Europe as a result of that. So what we have started to do is communicate how the wholesale price of electricity dramatically reduces when we have wind energy available versus the days when we're completely reliant on gas. So on average, we put out a communication every single month to say, on the windiest days your prices were this amount, and on the least windy days your prices were this. And on average it's about a 50% reduction in price that we see because of wind energy on the days when we have the renewable energy available. And then we're also doing things like myth busting campaigns. So there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there around wind energy about its impact on things like the environment or electricity prices or the sustainability of the components that go into wind energy. So it's really about just getting facts out there in really easy to understand information in a way that always use plain English when you're trying to explain it, and try to really simplify language language so that it just makes sense to people. So there's a lot, I've given you a couple of examples there, that is done at a local level in projects, but then also at a national level in partnership with our government.
Thank you. Yeah, we do a lot of that too, dispelling myths and what you said about the comparison on windy, non-windy days. You gave us an idea to work on there. Let's turn to challenges ahead. What would you say are the main challenges facing the wind energy sector in Ireland today? Are they technical, regulatory, financial, or perhaps all of the above?
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, all of the above. There's elements of all three that we're working on every single day to try to solve them and try to roll it out. Just on technical challenges, I mentioned that we're trying to move towards a system that is getting towards 100% renewable electricity at times. So there's technical issues that we still have not fully overcome for how to operate a system that's fully non-synchronous. I mentioned things like battery energy storage and synchronous condensers. That's definitely part of it. There's likely other technologies that will be required to get us to that point. We also have a situation in Ireland where we have a very fast growing electricity demand base that's predominantly being driven by industrial customers. So not only are we trying to move from 40% renewable electricity to 80% renewable electricity, the share of electricity demand is dramatically increasing at the exact same time. For us to even maintain 40%, we need very substantial year-on-year growth of wind energy to be able to do that. We're certainly working towards, and a big part of our role is, it goes back to that price point is trying to make wind energy and renewable energy as price competitive as possible to give affordable energy to customers so we can grow our economy. I would say one of the biggest barriers, if I had to, and I think a lot of countries in Europe are dealing with this, is our electricity grid infrastructure and how quickly can we build electricity grids. Wind farms and solar farms can be built faster than 220 kV lines or 400 kV lines. It just takes longer. It covers a much larger land area. There's a lot more community and public engagement that's required. And we've seen very slow progress, I would say, in this in Ireland over the last 15 years. We invested a lot in our electricity grid up until about 2005. And there was a lot of space and headroom in that. And we've used up most of that now. That's why we're looking at technologies like long duration energy storage. That's multi-day storage for renewable energy so that we can use that on the days when we don't necessarily have the wind and solar available because our grid is not quite there. And then the last thing I would say is just on the regulatory side. The EU, after the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, they put in some fantastic regulation on Repower EU and the Renewable Energy Directive to try to simplify permitting. And we haven't seen that fully rolled out yet in Ireland. There are elements that have been rolled out and those have been very successful, but there's other things that have not been rolled out and it is quite slow. And my understanding across Europe is that this has been too slow, unfortunately. So I think kind of planning and grid are still some of the big challenges that we have.
That sounds very familiar.
Yeah, now, I think so.
You touch on prices a couple of times already. With such a large share of electricity coming from wind, many people are curious, how is that affecting electricity prices in Ireland? Is wind helping to stabilize or even reduce costs for consumers?
It is, absolutely. So this was a big topic that came up, particularly around the time when the energy price crisis kicked off in Europe. Electricity prices in Ireland are still some of the highest in Europe, and that's because of our reliance on imported fossil fuels, because we don't have any of our own supply really, and we're at the end of that gas pipeline. We're kind of getting the most expensive gas in Europe as a result of that. So one thing that we've tried a lot to do is build up an evidence base for explaining to the public, as I mentioned, that wind energy reduces wholesale prices. Wholesale prices make up about 40 to 50% of people's bills here in Ireland. So on the days when we have the most wind energy available, if we're cutting the wholesale price in half, that is having a material impact on your electricity bill. And we've really tried to draw that story and that narrative together. We also did a piece of work in 2019, and we repeated it last year, which looked at how much has public subsidies invested into renewable energy, and has there been a payback to the public yet? Has the money that's gone into auction systems from our government led to a reduction in price for consumers? And what it found in 2019 was that to roll out at the time 4 gigawatts of wind energy, it cost people €1 per year to do that. That was the overall price. So really good investment. And what we've seen since then is obviously the energy prices have skyrocketed, and wind energy has played a huge depressing role on that. So now wind energy has way more than paid back to the consumer to the tune of hundreds of millions of euro. So every single person in Ireland is about €130 better off because of wind energy and Ireland's investment that has been made in wind energy. We can see that growing year on year on year. The evidence going out to 2030 highlights that the savings are just going to continue increasing and increasing. Carbon prices get higher as fossil fuel prices even stay the same level. The long-term outlook looks like that they will stay the same level, if not get more expensive. And we're just about to tap into offshore wind energy as well, which will be a huge component of our energy system in the next 5 or 10 years to really reduce those prices down further. So yeah, it's a big focus for us at the moment, and it's a big issue in Ireland.
Well, also a big issue here. That sounds very compelling.
Yes.
Looking ahead, Ireland aims to produce 80% of its electricity from renewables by 2030, with wind playing the starring role. What are the key steps needed to reach that goal, and what does success look like from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a big challenge. I think right now, because of a couple of delays in the last few years, really based on, we set those targets and then COVID came along, supply chain slowed down, the energy price crisis distracted, I think, people for a couple of years because we had to really focus on that. So while that target of 80% renewable electricity was set prior to COVID and prior to the energy price crisis, I think we kind of lost 2 years there. And so we're unlikely to hit it by 2030, but I think we could hit it by maybe 2032 or 2033. It's kind of looking like now. Some of the big challenges there are, let's say, for onshore wind energy. I mentioned that we're trying to get from 5 gigawatts to 9 gigawatts. We had very slow permitting of onshore wind in the early part of this decade. That has really sped up now. In the last kind of 7 or 8 months, we've had 1 gigawatt permitted for onshore wind energy in the country, and there's 3 gigawatts in planning. 3 gigawatts already have permitting. So I think we're going to hit that 9 gigawatt target, but we'll probably just miss 2030. It'll probably be into 2031, 2032 because of supply chain challenges. That's one of the big things that we're trying to work through at the moment. And then for offshore wind energy, we had there was a lot of work that we needed to do to roll out offshore wind. So I understand it's similar in Bulgaria, maybe some of the opportunities that you have in the Black Sea. We didn't have a legal framework for offshore wind permitting until 3 years ago. So that took a lot of work to get something like that in place so that projects can apply for consent. So we now have 5 projects that have applied for consent that are 4 gigawatts in total, roughly. And those projects have won government auctions or trying to obtain a corporate PPA from large energy users at the moment too. So those projects will probably deliver in 2031, 2032. And then we've got our second offshore wind auction at the end of this year with more auctions to follow year on year after that. So we're getting there. I think what would success look like to me? I think success would look like hitting that 80% target as early as possible in the 2030s and having construction well underway for several offshore wind projects by 2030 so that they can be done in 2031 or 2032. And for, I think, just increasing public support and acknowledgement for wind energy by 2030 as well. We currently have about 80% of our population that are supportive of wind. So it'd be great to work on that other 20%.
Wow. Well, we conspire to 80% here. I wish you success with those other goals. Noel, thank you so much for sharing your insights. Ireland's progress in wind energy is a powerful example of what's possible when ambition meets action. But it's clear that continued collaboration, smart policy, and community engagement are essential to take the next step. To our listeners, if you'd like to learn more or get involved, we encourage you to follow the social media channels of Bulgarian Wind Energy Association. There you'll find more information regarding the Bulgarian wind energy industry. Join us next time as we continue to explore how renewable energy is reshaping our future.
Thanks very much, Ken.